On May 19, 1845, two ships slipped down the Thames River into history and oblivion. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, bound for the Arctic, carried 129 men, 3 years of provisions, and the absolute confidence of an empire at its zenith. Crowds lined the banks, waving handkerchiefs as the vessels disappeared toward the horizon. Not one of those men would ever return. Not one would ever see England again. They were sailing toward the most catastrophic disaster in the history of polar exploration, though nobody watching that spring morning could have imagined it. This is the story of the Franklin expedition, and how the most advanced Arctic voyage ever attempted became a frozen nightmare that would haunt the world for over a century and a half. To understand what went wrong, we must first understand what went right, or at least what seemed right. We must understand the man who led this doomed enterprise, the age that produced him, and why everyone, from the poorest sailor to the lords of the Admiralty, believed this expedition could not fail. Sir John Franklin was 59 years old, portly, with thinning hair and soft features that belonged more to a gentleman's club than an ice-locked ship. His critics whispered he was too old, too comfortable, too fond of good dinners and warm fires. They called him the man who ate his boots, a reference to his first Arctic expedition in 1819, when starvation had reduced his party to boiling and consuming their leather footwear. 11 men had died on that journey. Franklin himself had nearly perished, saved only by indigenous rescuers who found him stumbling, delirious, across the tundra. Yet somehow Victorian England had transformed that catastrophe into legend. Franklin hadn't failed. He had persevered. He had suffered and survived, proof that British fortitude could overcome any hardship. He had led another Arctic expedition from 1825 to 1827, more successful this time, mapping hundreds of miles of northern coastline. He had served as Lieutenant Governor of Tasmania, though that posting ended in controversy. By 1845, Franklin was the man who needed redemption, one final triumph to crown a long career. The Royal Navy offered him exactly that: command of an expedition to solve the greatest geographical mystery of the age, the Northwest Passage. For 300 years it had obsessed explorers and killed them by the hundreds. A navigable route through the Arctic archipelago of northern Canada, connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. It promised not just glory but enormous commercial power. Whoever controlled the passage would control a shortcut that could revolutionize global trade. The Spanish had sought it, the Dutch had died looking for it, the French had tried and failed, and the British had poured ships and men into the ice for generations, each expedition pushing a little further, mapping a little more coastline, shrinking the blank spaces on the charts. By 1845, those blank spaces had narrowed to a relatively small area around King William Island. Surely one final push, with modern ships and modern technology, would solve the puzzle. The lords of the Admiralty were certain of it. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were not ordinary ships. They were bomb vessels, built to absorb the recoil of massive mortars, which made their hulls extraordinarily strong. Both had already survived James Clark Ross's Antarctic expedition from 1839 to 1843, proving themselves against southern ice. For Franklin's voyage they were reinforced further: additional oak planking, iron plating over the bows, internal heating systems with hot water pipes running through the lower decks. And most revolutionary of all, they were fitted with steam engines adapted from railway locomotives, driving retractable screw propellers. When wind failed, the ships could power themselves forward mechanically. No Arctic expedition had ever been so well equipped. The provisioning reflected this confidence. 3 years of supplies, tens of thousands of pounds of salt beef and biscuit, barrels of flour and sugar, gallons of wine and spirits, and crucially, 8,000 tins of preserved meat and vegetables. Canning was revolutionary technology, barely 3 decades old, and it promised to solve the ancient problem of food spoilage on long voyages. The crew would eat well, stay healthy, and complete their mission in comfort. They even packed a library of 1,200 books, musical instruments including a hand organ that could play 50 tunes, school supplies for teaching illiterate sailors to read, and fine china with the ship's crests embossed in gold. The officers would dine with sterling silver cutlery and cut crystal wine goblets. This wasn't vanity, it was philosophy. British civilization, British discipline, British superiority would be maintained even at the top of the world. The ice would yield to culture and technology. The crew was carefully selected from thousands of volunteers. Every position was sought after, competed for, because Arctic service meant prize money and advancement and glory. Franklin's second in command was Francis Crozier, captain of HMS Terror, 49 years old and one of the most experienced ice navigators alive. Crozier was Irish, practical, and deeply skeptical about the expedition's prospects. He had just been rejected in marriage by Franklin's niece, possibly because of his Irish background and lack of social polish. He sailed north with a broken heart and serious doubts. James Fitzjames, 33, commanded HMS Erebus under Franklin's overall authority. Charming, handsome, ambitious, he had no Arctic experience but boundless confidence. His letters home sparkled with enthusiasm. Lieutenant Graham Gore was an experienced polar hand. Ice masters. James Reed and Thomas Blanky could read pack ice like other men read books, finding channels where others saw only barriers. Below decks were engineers, blacksmiths, carpenters, sailmakers, marines, able seamen. Most were in their 20s and 30s, strong men who had beaten out competitors for these positions. They felt proud, they felt chosen. As Erebus and Terror prepared to sail, they had every reason to believe in their success. The newspapers certainly did. Articles proclaimed the expedition a certainty, its triumph merely a matter of time. The ships departed Greenhithe on May 19th, sailed to the Orkney Islands for final provisions, and there Lady Jane Franklin bid her husband goodbye. She was a remarkable woman, well-traveled and intelligent, devoted to her husband despite his flaws. She watched the ship sail away with ordinary anxiety, normal fear, never imagining she would spend the rest of her life and her entire fortune searching for him, never imagining his name would become synonymous with Arctic horror. From the Orkneys, the expedition reached Greenland in early July. At Disco Bay, Franklin sent his last letters home, cheerful and optimistic. Several sick men were invalided back to England, leaving 129 souls aboard the two ships. On July 26, 1845, two whaling vessels encountered Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay, moored to an iceberg while waiting for favorable ice conditions. The whalers observed Franklin's ships for several hours. Everything appeared normal, routine. The crews went about their duties. Officers seemed confident. The captains exchanged pleasantries across the water, wished each other luck, and parted ways. That was the last time anyone from the outside world saw Franklin's expedition alive. The ships entered Lancaster Sound and vanished into the ice. For the first year, nobody worried. Arctic expeditions were expected to winter in the ice. It was normal, planned for. Franklin had 3 years of provisions and explicit instructions not to send word unless he encountered difficulties. No news was good news. The British public went about their lives, occasionally wondering where Franklin might have reached, confident he was pushing steadily toward the Pacific. The summer of 1846 passed. Still no word. Perhaps he had found the passage and sailed through to the Pacific. Perhaps he was waiting to cross back and deliver his triumph in person. The summer of 1847 passed, and now people began asking questions. 2 years without communication. Lady Franklin wrote to the Admiralty, requesting information, receiving polite assurances that everything was certainly fine. By 1848, alarm bells were ringing. 3 years after departure, Franklin's provisions would be exhausted. If he had not emerged in the Pacific, if he had not returned to the Atlantic, if he had sent no messages, then something had gone catastrophically wrong. Reluctantly, the Admiralty organized relief expeditions. Ships entered the Arctic from both east and west, searching for any sign of Erebus and Terror, any trace of 129 missing men. They found nothing. The Arctic is vast beyond comprehension, empty and merciless. 2 ships had entered that frozen wilderness and disappeared as completely as if they had sailed off the edge of the world. It would be years before the first clues emerged, decades before the full horror became clear, and more than a century and a half before the wrecks were finally discovered on the ocean floor. But in those early years of searching there was only silence, only ice, only the question that would obsess Victorian England and echo through history: what happened to Franklin? The truth, had anyone known it in 1848, would have been unbearable. By the time the first rescue ships were being fitted out in British harbors, most of Franklin's men were already dead. Their bodies lay scattered across the ice in the barren islands of the Arctic archipelago, frozen in the positions where they had collapsed, and the handful still alive were facing horrors that would have seemed impossible to the cheering crowds who had watched them sail away just 3 years earlier. The glorious beginning was already over. The ships were locked in ice that would never release them. The tinned food that was supposed to sustain them was poisoning them. Their leader was already dead and buried. And the ordeal that would transform the Franklin expedition from a proud voyage of discovery into a byword for suffering and catastrophe was only just beginning. The ice was waiting. It had infinite patience, and it would keep its secrets for a very, very long time. The ice closed around HMS Erebus and HMS Terror on September 12, 1846, and it would never let them go. 105 men were still alive at that moment, unaware they had just crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The ships had become their tombs. They simply didn't know it yet. After their last sighting by whalers in July 1845, Erebus and Terror crossed into Lancaster Sound and pushed west with remarkable speed. Ice conditions that summer were unusually favorable, the channels clear. Franklin sailed past Beechey Island, past Cornwallis Island, past Bathurst Island, reaching the western edge of the mapped world by early September. He was closer to the Pacific than any Atlantic expedition had ever reached. Then the ice stopped them. This was expected, normal. Arctic navigation was only possible during the brief summer thaw. From September to July, the sea froze solid. Ships locked in place, crews forced to wait out the long polar night. Franklin had anticipated this. He had provisions for 3 years specifically because he expected 2, possibly 3 winters trapped in ice. He chose Beechey Island for the first winter, a desolate spit of gravel on Devon Island's southwestern coast. On September 10th, 1845, the ships moored in the small harbor and prepared for 9 months of darkness. We know they wintered at Beechey Island because of what searchers found there years later. 3 graves, the remains of a forge, scattered debris. And those 3 graves tell a story written in frozen corpses. John Torrington, leading stoker, 20 years old, died January 1st, 1846. Barely 3 months into the expedition, the wooden marker cited consumption as the cause. John Hartnell, able seaman, 25 years old, died January 4th, 1846, 3 days after Torrington. His marker also read consumption. William Brain, Royal Marine, 25 years old, died April 3rd, 1846, as winter finally released its grip. Consumption again. 3 young men, all supposedly dead of the same disease, buried in graves hacked from frozen gravel. Their shipmates wrapped them in cloth, placed them in wooden coffins, carved names and dates into markers, and continued on. Death was part of exploration. You mourned and you moved forward, but those 3 bodies, frozen solid in permafrost, would remain perfectly preserved for nearly a century and a half. When researchers exhumed them in the 1980s, they discovered what the word consumption had hidden: extraordinarily high levels of lead in the tissues. Lead poisoning had ravaged these men, weakening them, making them vulnerable to disease and death. The source was almost certainly the 8,000 tins of preserved food the expedition carried. Canning was new technology, the sealing process crude. Tins were soldered with lead, often hastily, sloppily. The contractor Stefan Goldner had rushed to meet his deadline, employing unskilled workers who applied solder that came into direct contact with food inside. Lead leached into meat and vegetables, building up in the body over months. Anemia, weakness, neurological damage, organ failure, death. Every meal from those tins was poison. But in the winter of 1845 to 46, they had no way of knowing. When the ice broke up in July 1846, Erebus and Terror sailed south, down Peel Sound into waters no European had ever navigated. Franklin was following his orders, probing for the passage. The ships made excellent progress through July and August, passing Somerset Island, entering the strait between Prince of Wales Island and King William Island. Then in early September 1846, the ice caught them again, this time in the worst possible location, Victoria Strait, northwest of King William Island, in the grip of the heaviest, most persistent pack ice in the entire Arctic. Currents and winds created a vast rotating gyre of multi-year ice that never fully melted, ice that could crush ships like insects. On September 12, 1846, exactly 1 year after Beechey Island, the ships locked in ice 15 miles northwest of King William Island. They would never move under their own power again. Still, no immediate panic. The ships were designed for this. The crews were experienced. They had provisions for 2 more years. Surely the ice would break up next summer and they could continue. The men settled in for their second Arctic winter, probably still confident this was temporary. We know almost nothing about the winter of 1846 to 47. No journals survived, no letters. Only a single document discovered years later provides any information, and it tells us almost nothing about daily life during those months of darkness. But we know what was happening to them. The lead poisoning continued, every meal adding more toxin. Lead causes neurological damage, poor decision-making, fatigue, weakness. Scurvy was appearing, vitamin C degrading in the preserved food. Bleeding gums, loosening teeth, old wounds reopening, organ failure. Tuberculosis spreading in the cramped, poorly ventilated quarters. Pneumonia, frostbite turning to gangrene. And sometime that winter, probably in early June 1847, Sir John Franklin died. We know the date from that single surviving document, a standard Admiralty form left in a cairn on King William Island. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. No cause given, no details. Just the bare fact. The commander was dead. He was 61 years old. Lead poisoning, scurvy, pneumonia, heart attack, accumulated stress. We'll never know. His officers buried him with full naval honors, reading prayers over his shrouded body before committing it to ice or frozen ground. His exact burial location has never been found. Command passed to Francis Crozier, the skeptical Irishman with the broken heart. He was now responsible for 104 surviving men, 2 ships locked in ice, and a deteriorating situation, because summer 1847 came and went, and the ice did not release them. The ships remained frozen, surrounded by pack ice that showed no signs of breaking up. This was catastrophic. The ice should have loosened, channels should have opened, but the peculiar conditions around King William Island kept the pack solid and immobile. By September 1847, facing a third winter in the ice, Crozier must have known they were in serious trouble. They had provisions for 3 years. More than 2 years were gone. They might stretch the remaining food through strict rationing to summer 1848, but if the ice didn't release them then, they would starve. The third winter, 1847 to 48, was a nightmare. More men died, somewhere between 20 and 25 based on later evidence, their bodies committed to ice graves or buried in snow. The lead poisoning was advanced, affecting everyone. Officers making poor decisions, struggling with simple tasks. Scurvy widespread, men too weak to work, food desperately short, coal for heating nearly exhausted, and still the ice held them. Crozier faced an impossible choice: stay with the ships and hope for release in summer 1848, or abandon the vessels and march overland to safety. Both options were terrible. The ships offered shelter but might become death traps. Marching offered a chance of reaching a Hudson's Bay Company post hundreds of miles south, but meant hauling supplies across hostile terrain with men already dying. In April 1848, Crozier made his decision. They would abandon the ships. On April 22, 1848, officers climbed onto King William Island and built a stone cairn at Victory Point. Inside, they placed an Admiralty form with 2 notes providing the only first-hand account that would ever be found. The first note, dated May 28, 1847, was optimistic. Written by Lieutenant Graham Gore, it reported they'd wintered at Beechy Island, that Franklin commanded, that all was well. The second note, crammed into the margins, told a different story. Written by Fitzjames and signed by Crozier, dated April 25, 1848, it recorded Franklin's death. It stated Erebus and Terror had been abandoned 3 days earlier. It listed the casualties: 9 officers and 15 men dead, leaving 105 survivors. And it stated their intention: march south to the Back River. 105 men were about to walk into the Arctic wilderness, weakened by poison and disease, with inadequate supplies, and no realistic hope of covering hundreds of miles to safety. The ice had held the ships for nearly 2 years, freezing the men, starving them, poisoning them. Now it would watch as they stumbled away and scattered across the frozen wasteland. They left behind their wooden prisons on April 22, 1848. They hauled sledges loaded with supplies, dragging boats mounted on runners for crossing open water they might encounter. They were already weak, already dying, many barely able to walk. The expedition that had sailed from England with such confidence, with the finest ships and the most advanced technology, with silver cutlery and libraries and hand organs, was reduced to a column of sick, desperate men stumbling across the ice toward a salvation that didn't exist. The nightmare was entering its final phase, and the horror that awaited them would be beyond anything Victorian England wanted to believe possible. 105 men dragged sledges across the ice on April 22, 1848, leaving HMS Erebus and HMS Terror forever. They were already dying. Lead poisoning had damaged their brains and organs. Scurvy had loosened their teeth and reopened old wounds. Starvation had reduced them to walking skeletons. Some could barely stand, leaning on companions as they stumbled south across King William Island. They were marching toward salvation that didn't exist, but they didn't know that yet. Or perhaps they did, and simply refused to acknowledge it. Either way, they walked, because the alternative was staying with the ships and freezing to death, and at least walking offered the illusion of hope. This is the final chapter of the Franklin expedition, the death march that scattered 105 bodies across hundreds of miles of Arctic wasteland, and created a mystery so horrifying that Victorian England would spend decades denying the truth. Captain Crozier's plan was, on paper, logical. March south across King William Island to the Adelaide Peninsula, follow the coastline east to the mouth of the Back River, travel up that river heading south until reaching a Hudson's Bay Company post at Fort Resolution. 800 miles total, 800 miles through the most hostile terrain on Earth, with men already sick and starving, hauling sledges and boats in temperatures that could drop to 40 below zero. It was impossible, but it was the only option they had left. The expedition divided into smaller groups, each hauling sledges and boats mounted on wooden runners. The boats were essential for crossing open water and navigating rivers, but incredibly heavy. A standard naval cutter weighed over 700 pounds empty, much more when loaded. Dragging these boats across rough ice, up and down pressure ridges, through snow and gravel, required enormous effort from men who had almost no strength left. We know some of what they carried because search parties later found abandoned sledges scattered across King William Island. The items discovered paint a picture of men making inexplicable decisions, their judgment destroyed by lead poisoning. They carried books, heavy volumes serving no survival purpose, sterling silver cutlery in careful sets, button polish and clothing brushes, a small writing desk with brass fittings, silk handkerchiefs and slippers and curtain rods. One sledge contained 8 pairs of boots, multiple sets of clothing, towels, soap, sponges, a piece of scented red cheese, and 40 pounds of chocolate. 40 pounds of chocolate is useful, button polish is not. Yet they carried both, because their minds no longer functioned correctly. Lead poisoning causes cognitive impairment, inability to distinguish essential from unnecessary. Men who should have been ruthlessly discarding weight were instead carefully packing luxuries, unable to accept that their civilized world had completely collapsed. The march began in late April with temperatures well below freezing. Imagine it. You haven't eaten properly in months. Your gums bleed constantly, teeth loose in your jaw. Your hands and feet are numb from frostbite that never heals. You can't think clearly because lead has damaged your brain. Every breath burns your lungs, and you're harnessed to a sledge weighing hundreds of pounds, hauling it across ice in the company of men who look like corpses. You manage perhaps 3 or 4 miles per day. Then you stop, set up tents, try to sleep while the temperature drops further. You wake to another day of exactly the same suffering, and somewhere deep in whatever part of your mind still functions, you know you're not going to make it. But you keep walking, because what else can you do? The first deaths probably occurred within days. Men collapsed while hauling sledges and couldn't get up again. Their companions stopped, gathered around, watched them die. They might have buried the bodies if they had strength to chip through frozen ground. More likely they just left them, covered with snow or canvas, marked with stones if there was time. Then the survivors continued south, because stopping meant dying too. By early May they'd reached King William Island's western coast and turned south, following the shoreline. This was harder terrain, pressure ridges of ice pushed up by currents, some 30 feet high, forming frozen mountains that had to be crossed. Each ridge required unloading sledges, hauling everything to the top, lowering it down the other side, reloading, continuing, exhausting work consuming entire days for minimal progress. Groups began to fragment. The weakest couldn't keep pace. They fell behind, separated from the main party, stumbled along until they collapsed. Some tried to return to the ships. Others simply stopped moving and waited to die. Bodies appeared along the route. Later search parties would find them, frozen corpses in Royal Navy uniforms scattered like breadcrumbs leading south. Some were carefully buried. Others were simply lying where they had fallen. And some showed signs that would horrify the searchers and create a scandal Victorian England desperately wanted to suppress. They'd been butchered, cut marks on bones, skulls smashed open to access the brain, long bones split lengthwise to extract marrow, ribs separated from vertebrae with knives. The evidence was unmistakable. The Franklin expedition had resorted to cannibalism. This shouldn't surprise us. Starvation drives people to extremes unthinkable under normal circumstances. When you're dying of hunger, when your companions' bodies lie there full of protein that could keep you alive a few days longer, the taboo against eating human flesh begins to seem less absolute, especially when your judgment is impaired by lead poisoning and you're half mad from suffering. But Victorian England found it shocking. Impossible to believe that British naval officers would engage in such savagery. When evidence emerged, it was met with denial and outrage. Lady Jane Franklin spent years and enormous money trying to suppress the reports, trying to preserve her husband's reputation. The evidence, however, was undeniable, and it came from the most unlikely source, the Inuit people who lived in the region and had witnessed the expedition's final days. The Inuit had known something was wrong for years. In 1848 and 1849, they encountered groups of strange white men hauling boats and sledges, starving and desperate. The Inuit tried to help, offering food and advice, but the expedition members largely refused, either from pride, inability to communicate, or from lead-poison paranoia. An Inuit hunter named Inukpu told searchers about encountering a group of white men dragging a boat south. The men were emaciated, sick, barely able to walk. He offered to help them hunt seals, but they refused or didn't understand. He watched them continue south and never saw them again. Another testimony described finding a large tent on the Adelaide Peninsula with approximately 30 bodies inside and around it. Some deaths were recent, others obviously months old, and some showed evidence of having been cannibalized by survivors before they too died. The most detailed account came from an Inuit woman whose grandmother had found white men's bodies scattered across the land. She described corpses in boats, in tents, on open ground. Some had died of starvation. Others appeared to have been killed by their companions, skulls crushed, bones showing defensive wounds. Many had been partially consumed. One disturbing account described white men the Inuit observed from a distance, too frightened to approach. The men were butchering something on the ice. The Inuit assumed it was a seal. Only later, examining the site, did they discover it had been one of their own companions. By June 1848, 2 months after abandoning the ships, the expedition had fragmented into multiple groups scattered across King William Island and the Adelaide Peninsula. The largest group, possibly 50 or 60 men, made it as far south as a place later called Starvation Cove, roughly where they would have turned east toward the Back River. They never made that turn. They collapsed at Starvation Cove, too weak to continue. Some died quickly, others lingered for weeks or months, consuming the dead, desperately trying to stay alive. Eventually they all died. Bodies were found all along the route. A group of 6 skeletons was discovered at Erebus Bay, on King William Island's southern coast, arranged in an abandoned boat. 4 skulls showed evidence of having been smashed open. Another group was found at Terror Bay, further north. These bodies were more carefully buried, suggesting earlier deaths when survivors still had strength and will to conduct proper funerals. But even these graves showed signs of later disturbance, possibly by desperate survivors returning to cannibalize bodies they'd previously buried with respect. Lieutenant John Irving's body was found in 1879, 31 years after his death, identified by personal effects including a medal and mathematical instruments. He'd been carefully buried, his body intact, suggesting he'd died relatively early when companions still maintained discipline and dignity. But the bodies found further south told a different story. These were the men who died last, when all pretense of civilization had collapsed, when survival became the only imperative. These bodies were incomplete, butchered, scattered. These were the evidence of the final horror. Somewhere in the summer of 1848, probably July or August, the last survivor died. We don't know his name or rank. We don't know if he died alone or with others. We don't know if he spent his final hours thinking of home, or if lead poisoning and starvation had reduced him to animal consciousness, aware only of cold and hunger. 105 men who walked away from the ships in April 1848, believing they could reach safety through determination and British discipline, all dead within months, their bodies scattered across hundreds of miles of frozen wasteland. The Franklin expedition, which had begun with such confidence and glory, ended with men eating their dead companions and dying alone in the ice. The ships they'd abandoned would remain frozen for years before finally sinking, taking any journals or detailed records with them. The silence that fell over the Arctic after the last man died would remain unbroken for years, a mystery that would obsess the world and launch dozens of search expeditions, all asking the same question. What happened to Franklin? The ice knew, the scattered bones knew, the Inuit knew, though it would be years before anyone believed them. The death march was over, the horror was complete. All that remained was for the world to discover what had happened, and to confront the terrible truth about how completely the Arctic had destroyed the most advanced polar expedition ever assembled. For 3 years, after Franklin's ships vanished into the Arctic, Britain waited. The public read newspaper speculation, confident that any day word would arrive of triumph, of the Northwest Passage conquered, of Franklin's name inscribed alongside Cook and Columbus. The Admiralty assured concerned families that silence was normal, that no news was good news. But by 1848, confidence was crumbling. 3 years had passed. Provisions would be running out. If Franklin had succeeded, surely word would have reached the whaling fleets or Russian settlements in Alaska. If he had failed and turned back, he should have emerged in the Atlantic. The silence had become deafening. Lady Jane Franklin was the first to sound the alarm. 56 years old in 1848, formidable, well-traveled, she knew something was catastrophically wrong. She began writing letters, pressing the Admiralty, appealing to public sentiment, demanding search expeditions immediately. The Admiralty finally yielded. In 1848, 3 relief expeditions were dispatched, one by land down the Mackenzie River, one by sea from the Atlantic through Lancaster Sound, one by sea from the Pacific through the Bering Strait. They found nothing. Year after year, more expeditions went north. By the early 1850s, the search had become a national obsession. Dozens of ships, hundreds of men, enormous resources poured into the Arctic, all seeking any trace of 129 missing souls. It was the largest rescue operation in history. Then in 1850, a breakthrough. Captain Erasmus Omine landed on Beechey Island and found the first winter camp. The remains of a forge, scattered debris, hundreds of empty tin cans, and 3 graves, carefully marked, John Torrington, John Hartnell, William Brain, all dead in the winter of 1845 to 46. The discovery sent shockwaves through Britain. 3 men dead in the first winter was concerning, but where had the expedition gone from Beechy Island? Searchers scoured the area for messages, for cairns containing notes. Nothing. Franklin had left and vanished completely. More years passed. More expeditions achieved nothing. The public began to lose hope. Perhaps Franklin and all his men were dead. Perhaps the mystery would never be solved. Lady Franklin refused to give up. She spent her entire fortune funding private expeditions. She appealed to the American government, to the Russian Tsar, to anyone who might send ships north, and in 1854 her persistence yielded results, though not the results she wanted. Dr. John Rae, a Scottish explorer working for the Hudson's Bay Company, encountered Inuit near Pelly Bay, who told him a disturbing story. Several years earlier, around 1850, they had seen a group of white men, perhaps 40 in number, traveling south across King William Island. The men were hauling boats and sledges. They were starving, sick, dying. The Inuit had tried to help, but the white men either couldn't understand or refused assistance. Later, the Inuit had found bodies, lots of bodies, scattered along King William Island's coasts and on the Adelaide Peninsula. Some buried, most simply lying where they'd fallen, and some showed signs that the last survivors had resorted to cannibalism. The Inuit offered physical evidence, silver spoons and forks with officers' crests, a medal belonging to Franklin himself, fragments of uniform, portions of a gold watch chain. Combined with the testimony, the picture was clear. Franklin's men had abandoned their ships and died attempting to march south, and in their final extremity, they had eaten their dead. Rae returned to England and reported his findings. The reaction was explosive. The British public, the press, even Charles Dickens himself refused to believe British naval officers would engage in cannibalism. It was impossible, unthinkable, a slander against heroes. The Inuit must be lying, mistaken, savages who didn't understand civilized men. Lady Franklin was particularly fierce in her denials. She attacked Rae publicly, questioned his credibility, spent enormous sums trying to discredit his report. She organized another search expedition, commanded by Captain Leopold McClintock, with explicit instructions to find evidence contradicting Rae's terrible claims. McClintock's expedition, sailing in the yacht Fox, left England in 1857 and spent 2 years searching. In 1859 they found what Lady Franklin had been seeking for 14 years, proof of what had happened, but that proof only confirmed Rae's account. On King William Island, McClintock's men found a cairn at Victory Point, containing the only written message ever recovered from the expedition, the 2-part note written in 1847 and 1848, recording Franklin's death and the ship's abandonment. They found a boat mounted on a sledge containing 2 skeletons and a bizarre collection: chocolate, tea, tobacco, silk handkerchiefs, slippers, towels, soap, books, silverware. The boat pointed north, suggesting these men had been trying to return to the ships, perhaps realizing the march south was hopeless. They found more skeletons scattered along the coast. Some showed cut marks on bones. Some had been partially dismembered. The evidence was undeniable, though McClintock's official report described it delicately as mutilation of bodies. McClintock gathered more Inuit testimony. The stories were consistent: white men hauling boats, dying as they marched south, bodies scattered across the landscape. One hunter described finding a large tent with over 30 bodies inside and around it, the last survivors dying together. Another described finding tracks in snow suggesting men staggering southward, falling one by one, until the tracks ended with a single body lying face down. The most haunting testimony came from an Inuit woman who as a child had found a camp with dead white men arranged strangely, some sitting upright against rocks, some in neat rows, suggesting the last survivors had carefully arranged their dead companions before themselves dying. The scene had frightened her people so much they'd avoided that area for years. McClintock returned to England in 1859 with overwhelming evidence. Franklin's expedition had ended in complete disaster. Ships trapped, Franklin dead in 1847, survivors abandoning vessels in 1848 and attempting to march to safety, all dead by late summer 1848, scattered across hundreds of miles. And yes, the last survivors had resorted to cannibalism. Lady Franklin received the news with grief, but also satisfaction. Her husband's fate was finally known. He had died early, June 1847, before the worst suffering. His reputation was intact. He hadn't been among those who abandoned the ships or ate the dead. She could mourn him properly now, erect monuments, secure his place in history as a hero. The British government officially declared all members dead and granted Lady Franklin a widow's pension. Monuments were erected in London, praising Franklin and his men for their courage and sacrifice. The cannibalism was mentioned obliquely, if at all, papered over with euphemisms. gradually forgotten by a public eager to remember heroism and forget horror. The search expeditions themselves had been costly, claiming their own victims. HMS Investigator became permanently trapped in pack ice and had to be abandoned, her crew rescued only after 3 years of Arctic nightmare. Several search vessels were crushed and sunk. Dozens of searchers died of scurvy, starvation, and exposure, the same fate as Franklin's men. The irony was bitter. The attempt to rescue Franklin had created new tragedies, new widows, new mysteries, but the search expeditions achieved something Franklin never did. They mapped vast areas of the Arctic archipelago. In searching for the lost expedition, explorers had charted hundreds of miles of coastline, discovered new islands and channels, filled in the blank spaces on Arctic maps. Ironically, the failure to save Franklin had succeeded in completing the geographical knowledge he had died seeking. And then, in 1903 to 1906, a Norwegian explorer named Roald Amundsen accomplished what Franklin could not. Amundsen sailed a small vessel, the Gjoa, through the Northwest Passage, becoming the first to navigate the route from Atlantic to Pacific. He succeeded where Franklin failed by doing everything differently. Small ship instead of large, small crew instead of over 100, willingness to learn from indigenous peoples instead of dismissing their knowledge, flexibility instead of rigid naval discipline. Amundsen paid tribute to Franklin's expedition, acknowledging that their suffering and death had helped map the route he successfully navigated, but the contrast was stark. Franklin's massive, technologically advanced expedition had been completely destroyed, while Amundsen's modest, adaptable approach had succeeded. The lesson was clear, though it took decades for the British establishment to fully absorb it. Technology and cultural superiority weren't enough. Respect for local knowledge and environmental humility mattered more than steam engines and canned food. For decades afterward, occasional search parties found more relics. A skeleton here, artifacts there, another boat, more uniform fragments. Each discovery added small details, but no fundamental new information. By the late 1800s, the search had ended. The basic facts were known. The Arctic had defeated the expedition completely. The Franklin expedition gradually faded from public consciousness. It became a historical footnote, a Victorian-era tragedy, a cautionary tale taught in British schools about imperial hubris. The Arctic kept its secrets, and the wrecks of Erebus and Terror lay somewhere on the ocean floor, undiscovered, until 1984, when modern science reached back across a century and a half to touch the dead. A team of researchers led by Dr. Owen Beatty from the University of Alberta obtained permission to exhume the 3 bodies buried at Beechey Island. The bodies, frozen solid in permafrost, were perfectly preserved. When researchers carefully opened the coffins, they found themselves staring into the faces of young men who had sailed with Franklin in 1845. John Torrington looked as though he was sleeping, eyes half open, skin pale and preserved by cold, hands crossed on his chest. He wore a striped cotton shirt. His dark hair was neatly combed. He looked peaceful, a 20-year-old frozen in time at the moment of death. The researchers took tissue samples and made a revolutionary discovery. All 3 bodies contained extraordinarily high levels of lead in bones, hair, soft tissues, enough to cause serious neurological damage, organ failure, cognitive impairment. The preserved food that was supposed to sustain the expedition had been poisoning the men from the first day they opened those hastily soldered tins. This explained so much. The poor decisions, carrying button polish instead of extra food, the inability to accept help from Inuit who could have taught them to hunt and survive, the apparent confusion and disorganization of the final march. Lead poisoning had damaged their brains, impaired judgment, weakened bodies. Combined with scurvy, starvation, and extreme cold, it had created a perfect storm dooming the expedition from the start. The exhumation became international news. Photographs of Torrington's face, eerily preserved, appeared in newspapers and magazines worldwide. The Franklin expedition was suddenly relevant again, no longer just a Victorian tragedy, but a cautionary tale about technology, hubris, what happens when you trust modern innovation over traditional knowledge. But the ships themselves remained lost. Despite numerous searches using increasingly sophisticated technology, nobody could find them. Sonar searches in the 1990s and 2000s found nothing. It seemed the ships would remain lost forever. Then in September 2014, a Canadian search expedition using modern underwater sonar and remotely operated vehicles found HMS Erebus lying on the ocean floor in Queen Maud Gulf, south of King William Island. The ship was remarkably well preserved, sitting upright on the bottom, recognizable despite a century and a half underwater. The discovery made headlines worldwide. After 169 years, one of Franklin's ships had finally been found. 2 years later, in September 2016, The search team found HMS Terror in Terror Bay, north of Erebus's wreck site. Terror was even better preserved, sitting upright in deeper water, protected from ice scour, looking as though it could sail again if lifted from the depths. Both discoveries were hailed as among the greatest achievements in marine archaeology. The wrecks are now protected sites, preserved for future scientific study. Plans exist to eventually recover artifacts, to explore interiors with robots, to see if any documents survived in sealed compartments. Perhaps someday we'll read Franklin's own account of the expedition's early days, or Crozier's thoughts as he made the decision to abandon the ships. But even without those answers, we know enough to tell the story. We know how 129 men sailed into the Arctic with confidence in technology and British discipline, and how completely they were destroyed. We know about the lead poisoning, the scurvy, the starvation, the desperation, the final terrible resort to cannibalism. We know the Inuit were right all along, that their testimony was accurate, that they tried to help and were rebuffed. We know Victorian England was wrong to dismiss their accounts, wrong to insist British sailors couldn't possibly descend into savagery, wrong to prioritize reputation over truth. The Franklin expedition has become more than a historical event. It's a metaphor for the dangers of hubris, for what happens when you ignore local knowledge and trust only your own cultural superiority. It's a reminder that technology alone isn't enough, that the newest innovations can fail catastrophically without wisdom. It's a lesson about the power of nature, about how easily ambition can be destroyed. And standing on the deck of a ship in the Arctic today, looking out across ice stretching to the horizon, it's impossible not to feel their presence. The ships on the ocean floor, the bones scattered across islands, the 3 perfectly preserved bodies in their graves at Beechy Island, 129 men who challenged the ice and lost everything, leaving behind echoes that took more than a century and a half to fully hear, and a mystery that will haunt us forever.